They called it the pinnacle of elegance, a palace forged from gold, mirrors, and royal ambition. Versailles, the shining jewel of 17th century France. The very name drips with luxury. When people imagine Louis XIV's court, they think of sweeping ballrooms, powdered wigs, silk-clad courtiers whispering behind fans, and the Sun King himself, radiant, absolute, godlike. But what if I told you this glittering court was also one of the filthiest places in European history? That beneath the brocade and velvet were lice, behind the perfume rot, and under those jeweled heels, a carpet of human waste. This wasn't just about poor plumbing. Versailles wasn't just unhygienic. It was a living, breathing contradiction. Obsessively polished on the surface, absolutely vile underneath. The same aristocrats who bathed in rosewater went months without washing their bodies. They smeared their faces with lead and powdered their hair with flour, while rats danced in the corridors and courtiers relieved themselves in stairwells. In this video, we repealing back the gilded wallpaper to reveal the true Versailles, a world where image mattered more than odor, where a filthy wig could be more valuable than a clean conscience, and where the king ruled not just through beauty, but through control, spectacle, and stench. So, prepare yourself. This is not the Versailles you saw in paintings. This is Versailles as it truly was, maggot-ridden, perfume-soaked, and utterly, magnificently disgusting. Versailles, the glittering jewel of France, the palace of mirrors and marble, where kings held court beneath chandeliers and nobles strutted in silk. But beneath all that gold and powdered pomp, Versailles had one monstrous secret. It had no toilets. None. Not for the servants, not for the guests, not for the powdered nobles dripping in perfume and privilege. The palace that claimed to be the center of civilization didn't have a functioning bathroom. No pipes, no sewers, no flushing. Just hundreds of people, gallons of wine, and nowhere for the shit to go. What happened instead? They went wherever they could. Behind tapestries, in fireplaces, down stairwells, in empty vases, along the pristine gravel paths of the royal gardens. If it had a corner and didn't belong to the king, someone had probably pissed in it. Some even took pride in it, leaving steaming calling cards like territorial cats in brocade. And Versailles wasn't a small building. It was a festering hive of humanity. Thousands of nobles, servants, musicians, cooks, dancers, guards, mistresses, and mice, all under one enormous, unventilated roof. And every single day, that roof trapped the rising fumes of filth like a gas chamber scented with rosewater. There were chamber pots, of course, ceramic basins tucked under beds and chairs, used during long evenings when the need hit suddenly. But those weren't emptied regularly. Sometimes they'd sit for days, fermenting, turning from piss to poison. Guests at royal balls would lift their gowns or open their breeches and squat right there in the hallway. Drunken dukes would vomit into flower pots. Countesses would relieve themselves behind drapes while still gossiping. Nobody blinked. The air reeked of sweat, piss, rotting food, and stale perfume. The corridors became slip-and-slide zones of human leakage. Servants tried to mask the stench with herbs. Thyme, rosemary, lavender. But it was like putting cologne on a corpse. And here's the kicker. This wasn't an accident. It was by design. Toilets were considered suspicious. Plumbing was for peasants and monks. The noble body was too sacred to share pipes with the masses. Real aristocrats didn't need privacy. They needed attention. Even in their most intimate moments. That's where the close stool came in. A fancy velvet-lined wooden chair with a hidden pot underneath, reserved for the king and his highest nobles. It looked like a throne, and in a way, it was. To sit on it was to prove your status. To be allowed to empty it was an honor. Enter the groom of the stool. Not a joke, but a title. A man so trusted that he handled the king's royal movements personally. He would help Louis XIV lower his drawers, wipe His Majesty's backside, clean the stool, and manage the contents, all while discussing politics. Yes, the king literally made state decisions while taking a shit. The groom of the stool knew everything: who the king trusted, who he hated, what upset his stomach, and who was poisoning the wine. If Versailles was ruled from a throne, it was this one, the one that stank. Now imagine thousands of people in a palace without plumbing, trying to maintain an illusion of godlike elegance. Versailles was a perfume-sprayed toilet, a place where beauty and bile mingled freely, and where the stink of rotting humanity hid behind a powdered wig. Every gilded hallway had a hidden stain. Every silk curtain had a suspicious crust. You could trace the lineage of dukes by the smell of their chambers. Versailles wasn't clean. 'Twas choreographed filth, and the king, he loved it. He saw no issue. Because as long as the mirrors were polished and the chandeliers sparkled, the filth didn't matter. The illusion held, and that was all that counted. At Versailles, a man's worth could be measured by the height of his wig. The taller, the better. The heavier, the more noble. A proper courtier might wear a powdered monstrosity made of human hair, horsehair, goat hair, even yak if he was feeling exotic. These wigs weren't accessories. They were monuments, towers of curled ambition, and beneath every powdered curl, crawling, biting, seething life. Lice, fleas. Mites, entire ecosystems of vermin nestled into the scalp and feasted in private. It started with the sweating. Versailles was a furnace. Picture 300 overdressed nobles packed into a room built for 20, standing shoulder to shoulder in wool, silk, velvet, lace, and then slap a 10-pound wig on top, powdered with starch and flour. Sweat poured down their necks, soaking into their collars and forming thick, greasy rivers underneath their hairpieces. That sweat was breakfast for lice. And the powder, it wasn't just for looks. It was a weapon meant to smother the bugs, but it only fed them. The lice dug deeper, nesting against the scalp, hiding behind curls. Men scratched constantly. Women carried ivory-handled lice combs in their handbags, politely excusing themselves from conversation to dig into their powdered domes. Some nobles tried poison. A dust of mercury here, a dab of arsenic there. But these only made the scalp peel and blister, turning flaky skin into feeding grounds for new infestations. One marquis, his name lost to time, but preserved in disgust, reportedly had to shave his head entirely after a colony of lice laid eggs so thick in his sideburns that they began to pulse. And still, the wigs got bigger. They were never washed. Too fragile, too expensive. Instead, they were brushed, powdered again, and perfumed with lavender or bergamot to hide the mildew. By midwinter, a courtier's wig might weigh more than a bowling ball, heavy with lice droppings, crusted with sweat, and stiff with starch. Some men stuffed dry tobacco leaves into the lining to repel bugs. Others stitched sachets of camphor under the brim. One particularly desperate duke allegedly set his wig by the fire to smoke out the vermin, only to return to a smoldering pile of hair and charred lace. He still wore it to dinner. Women weren't spared either. Their hair was their identity, their power. They braided in hair from servants, from animals, from corpses if need be. Hairstyles were so elaborate. Towering ships, battle scenes, cages filled with fake birds, that some ladies had to sleep sitting upright for weeks to preserve them. And sleep is when the horror crept in. Rats, the palace rats, hungry and fearless, had learned that powdered wigs smelled like food. Flour, lavender, grease. Ladies would wake to find their coifs not on. Or worse, something warm wriggling inside the nest of curls atop their heads. It was said, whispered, of course, that one unfortunate duchess screamed so loudly at a midnight nibble that she had to be sedated with opium for the rest of the season. but no one ever abandoned their wigs. Because at Versailles, to be bald, to show your actual head, was to surrender. Only the sick, the poor, or the imprisoned walked bareheaded. A noble's scalp was sacred, hidden, untouched by sun, wind, or shame. So they powdered, they perfumed. They combed and scratched and bled and smiled. Because the filth under your wig didn't matter, as long as you looked like a god above the neck. You could smell her before you saw her. Madame de Montpensier, Duchess by birth and spectacle by design, was known across Versailles not just for her powdered wigs or towering heels, but for the cloud of scent that surrounded her. Gardenia, musk, ambergris, clove, violets, and an ungodly amount of rose oil. She didn't walk, she wafted, like a mobile greenhouse of rotting petals. And yet, underneath that sickly sweet fog, she stank. You see, like most nobles at court, Madame believed that water was deadly. To bathe meant to let the devil into your pores, or so the physicians said. Warm water could unbalance the humors, spread disease, or even, God forbid, loosen your morals. So instead, the nobles of Versailles practiced what they called dry hygiene. Dry hygiene meant no soap, no scrubbing, no rinsing. It meant layering perfumes over sweat, oils over grime, and powder over sores. Madame de Montpensier had not bathed in weeks, possibly months. Her gowns, stitched from velvet and lace, were never washed, only aired out and misted with lemon oil. Her skin, once pale and soft, had begun to flake beneath the layers of powder, her underarms crusted with a yellowish wax. Her breath, despite chewing clove buds and rinsing with wine, reeked of decaying molars and throat rot. But still, she was beautiful. Beautiful in the way a rotting cake is still ornate. From across the ballroom, no one could tell. Up close, you wept. And she wasn't alone. This was Versailles' standard. Perfume wasn't about seduction. It was survival. It was a mask against the rot. Every nobleman carried a pomander, a tiny orb of scented herbs and spices, around their neck or on their waist, ready to be pressed to their nose when the stench of the room or another person became unbearable. Men wore gloves soaked in violet oil and handkerchiefs laced with cinnamon. Women stuffed their corsets with dried lavender and orange peels. Even the servants dusted their feet in crushed mint to keep from vomiting. But it never worked, not really, because under all the fragrance, Versailles was a petri dish in brocade. Open sores festered under corsets. Powdered wigs teemed with lice. Men with untreated syphilis would powder over their skin lesions with starch and white lead, creating a flaking crust that broke open when they laughed too hard. Their breath could curdle cream, and yet no one dared mention the smell, not to the king, not to the nobles. The scent of Versailles was a taboo, an invisible elephant marinating in its own musk. Madame de Montpensier once fainted during a garden party. The cause wasn't heat stroke. It was the combined assault of a farting cardinal, a rotting pheasant on the banquet table, and the overwhelming perfume haze that hung in the air like poisoned mist. But still, they continued. To them, perfume was proof of class, of power, of denial. Because the real filth wasn't just in the folds of unwashed gowns or the streaked legs of some foppish baron. The real filth was the lie, that this palace, with all its gold and glory, was anything but a rancid swamp in silk slippers. They didn't live in denial. They marinated in it, they celebrated it. And when they sprayed their rosewater, it wasn't to hide the filth. It was to pretend it had never existed. To walk through Versailles was to be dazzled. Crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, ceiling frescoes dripping with gold. But behind every gilded door, just beyond the perfume and powdered wigs, lurked a stench that no courtier could ignore. Versailles stank, not poetically, not faintly, a teat. Because beneath the glamour, the court of Louis XIV was built on a foundation of unfiltered, unflushed, and unapologetic human waste. The Sun King himself, absolute monarch of France, relieved his royal bowels on a padded wooden seat called a chaise a pierce chair. A ceramic bowl nestled beneath caught the royal offering. That bowl was then carried away by a designated servant known as the groom of the stool. And while his job was literal crap, he had direct access to the king's most private moments, and thus more power than half the nobles at court. And the rest of the court, they weren't so lucky. There were no toilets at Versailles, no plumbing, no sewage system, no flushing. Chamber pots were everywhere. In bedchambers, under staircases, behind curtains, in corners. Guests were known to relieve themselves in fireplaces when no one was looking. Servants dumped the pots into open pits, or, more often, out the nearest window. A warm breeze could carry the scent of human rot straight into the hall of mirrors. The gardens, so pristine in paintings, were public toilets in disguise. Behind hedges and sculptures, nobles squatted to do their business during events. If you ever wondered why Versailles was overrun with roses and lavender, it's because the palace needed to mask the smell of 1,000 bowel movements per day. The marble floors tracked with footprints and worse. On rainy days, servants tried to mop up the brown slush left behind by chamber pot spills and muddy shoes, only to smear it deeper into the cracks between the stones. Even the grand salons, where ambassadors were received and royal decrees were announced, had a scent. Not one of frankincense or myrrh, but a base note of piss and powder, clinging stubbornly to the tapestries and velvet. Let's talk about the courtier's personal hygiene. A lady might wear 5 layers of silk and satin, embroidered with pearls and thread of gold, but underneath, she was sweating into linen that hadn't been washed in weeks. Her undergarments were rarely changed. Most nobles bathed once a month, if that. And washing meant sponging your armpits with rose water, not actually scrubbing anything. In the heat of summer, the royal bedchambers smelled like a slaughterhouse that had been dusted with talcum powder. The men were no better. Their breeches were often crusted with sweat, powder, and traces of whatever they'd stepped in on the way to court. Leather shoes soaked up urine from the floors and never quite dried. Rats were everywhere. Big ones, bold ones. One was reportedly spotted scampering across the ballroom during a masked ball, wearing a pink ribbon tied around its tail, courtesy of a drunk duchess. But the worst filth wasn't the rat droppings or the chamber pots. It was what nobles didn't see. The walls of Versailles were hollow. Behind them, servants scurried up and down hidden corridors, called coulisses, carrying waste, mopping, vomit, and hauling soiled linens. The air in those passages was thick, sour, and hot. One maid reportedly fainted while carrying a night soil bucket through a hidden stairwell. No one found her until the next day. And when the pipes of the few makeshift latrines clogged, and they often did, the stink would rise like a ghost through the palace walls. The royal nose could never be safe. Louis XIV himself suffered from anal fistulas so painful they required surgery. A primitive, screaming affair performed without anesthesia in his own bed. The court watched. Yes, watched. Because attending to the royal sphincter was a mark of intimacy and trust. No one spoke of it, but everyone smelled it. And still, Versailles was worshipped. Because the stench was a small price to pay for proximity to the Sun King. It didn't matter if you were standing in piss-soaked shoes or eating off plates cleaned with old bread and vinegar. If you were at Versailles, you were somebody, even if the smell said otherwise. Versailles was built to dazzle, and it did. But underneath the crystal, the gold leaf, and the silks, something festering remained. Not just in the cracks between marble tiles or in the reeking shadow of chamber pots. It clung to history itself, a rotting core beneath a polished shell. Louis XIV may have died in his bed, surrounded by courtiers fanning away the stink of gangrene from his blackened legs. But his court lived on. Versailles outlasted the man, the makeup, the monarchic myth. And for a while, so did the illusion of elegance. But eventually, the perfume wore off. Because filth leaves stains, and Versailles had too many to hide. By the time Louis XV took the throne, the palace was already choking on its own waste. The cesspits were overflowing, a tease. The servants were exhausted. The curtains held more dust and odor than thread. Nobles tried to keep up appearances, powdering their wigs while rats chewed through their shoes. But the cracks were impossible to ignore. Foreign visitors began writing the truth. Letters sent home spoke not of Versailles grandeur, but of its stench. One ambassador noted that the nose suffers far more than the eyes rejoice. Another claimed the smell of the palace gardens, lovely from afar, turned his stomach the moment he stepped into them. Even the French peasants, living in filth of their own, joked that Versailles smelled like a gilded barnyard. By the reign of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the palace was a bloated corpse of its former glory. They tried to modernize, installing a few flushing toilets and cleaning up the worst of the decay. Marie had her own pastoral fantasy built at Petit Trianon, where she could pretend to be a milkmaid far away from the palace's stink. But no amount of soap, scented gloves, or imported porcelain could wash away Versailles' legacy of lavish filth. The irony? The very filth that nobles ignored or embraced became a symbol of their decay. While peasants starved and bathed in rivers, their rulers rotted in luxury they couldn't even smell anymore. And then came the guillotine. The revolution didn't just cut off heads, it cracked Versailles open like a rotten egg. The public stormed the palace not just to see its splendor, but to smell the hypocrisy. They found rooms caked in grime, kitchens swarming with mold, and waste holes that hadn't been cleaned in weeks. The fantasy was shattered. Versailles was never just a palace. It was a monument to delusion. A place where nobles danced on feces-polished floors while whispering poetry. Where women blackened their teeth to mimic royal rot. Where kings wiped with perfumed silk and called it civilization. Even after the monarchy fell, the stink remained. Tourists today don't smell the Versailles of the 17th century. It's been scrubbed, sanitized, deodorized, and museum-mified. But behind the velvet ropes and pristine chandeliers, the memory of filth lingers. In the walls, in the legends, in the absurdity of it all. Because Versailles was never clean. It was desperately, obsessively performative. A castle of lies wrapped in brocade and sprayed with rosewater. And that makes it the perfect icon of royal rot. A filthy glamour, too stubborn to die, and too dazzling to ignore. So the next time you see a painting of Louis XIV, chin high, wig skyward, robes trailing, remember what lies beneath. Not marble, not gold, but piss-soaked wood, powdered decay, and the silent screams of servants cleaning chamber pots at midnight. And maybe that is the real legacy of Versailles. Proof that no matter how much you gild it, filth always finds a way to shine through. So think Versailles was disgusting. You're not wrong. But it was just the beginning. Because if you thought royal courts were filthy, wait until you meet the monks who thought bathing was sinful, or the medieval doctors who reused leeches and never washed their hands, not even after amputations. In this series, we're diving deeper into the filth that history tried to perfume away. So hit subscribe, ring that bell, and prepare your nose, because we're just getting started. The past wasn't clean. It was sweaty, soiled, infected, and gloriously gross. Welcome to Filthy History, where every stain tells a story.